Thank you for joining us. We'll go ahead and get started. I'm Tamara Pratt. I serve as the Vice President of External Affairs and Marketing here at Rose State. And on behalf of our President, Dr. Jeannie Webb, who couldn't be with us this evening, I'd like to thank you for being here for what is a very timely topic, keeping our kids safe. And I'd like to thank in advance our panelists for being here. But I'm also hopeful that this will be a dialogue that we have, that we share, and that we start. Doesn't stop here, continues to move on. A couple of people I'd like to introduce you to who have some expertise in this as well. They come from our esteemed law enforcement as well as education as our background. I'd like to introduce you to Chief Brandon Claves with the Midwest City Police Department. He is also a regent here at Rose State College. And sitting right next to him is Roger Webb, President Emeritus of UCO. Please welcome Roger Webb. Dr. Webb has also served on as a consultant with the Regions, I believe, for school security, and both of these gentlemen sat on the Oklahoma Commission on School Security that was convened back in 2013. So they have some very intimate experience with some of this stuff and issues surrounding it. So before we begin, I'd like to just say thank you again and introduce you to your moderator, Jackie Wright. He's our Professor of Emergency Management here at Rose State. And of course, prior to coming here, he had lots of experience with emergency management as the State Director for the Oklahoma Department of Emergency Management.
Training Director.
Training Director. I knew I was going to get it wrong. I wrote down my notes and I still messed it up. So without further ado, please welcome our panelist and Jackie Wright.
Thank you, Tamara. Appreciate that. Let me help you understand what we're doing here tonight. This is the first of 7 of a speaker series that are designed to help people understand the specific nature of disasters as they affect Oklahoma, where, as many of you know, we're in the confluence of some pretty severe weather systems most of the time, and it's because of where we are geographically. So what we're attempting to do for now and for the next 7 times, approximately every 2 weeks, is to cover a topic that discusses specifically the types of incidents that have happened in Oklahoma, specific to Oklahoma. And we had to, unfortunately, because of the ice storm last week, cancel our first one, so we moved it forward. And we're blessed to have the panel that we have this evening with us, who are members of the Oklahoma, I'm going to mess this up, School Shooters Institute. I'm sorry, School Safety Institute.
Security.
Okay, I got it right the third time. School Security Institute, which is an office within the Oklahoma Office of Homeland Security. And I want to start off as a plug for them, rather a shameless plug. There are a lot of people who like to capitalize on the fear factor that's involved with things that happen, like recently in Florida. And the program that they offer is absolutely free. It's funded by the state. It's available to anyone who asks for it. And we're blessed to have that kind of a program here in the state. And I encourage everyone who's involved in education to take advantage of it. So without any further ado on that, welcome again, panelists, for being here. And I want to start off by allowing each one of you, if you would please, to introduce yourself. Give us a little bit of your background and where you came from, why you chose to be part of this. And I guess we'll start with the handsome guy, as he calls himself.
Handsome Gary, not so handsome Gary. Okay. I'm Gary Ruddick. I'm with the Oklahoma School Security Institute, and I'm retired from law enforcement after 37 years. I was retired from the Tulsa Police Department. I was chief of police in a couple of different places, including the Tulsa Public Schools Campus Police, which is an agency that we created. At the time was the largest public school policing agency in the state. I was privileged to serve along with Chief Claves and Dr. Webb on the School Security Commission in 2013 under Lieutenant Governor Lamb. And we've been working now for several years, working to make schools safer in Oklahoma.
Thank you, appreciate that.
I'm Jennifer Newell. I am the program manager for the School Security Institute. I am retired law enforcement as well. I worked for a little over 21 years with the Norman Police Department and actually retired to take this position to help build the Institute.
And I'm Gary Shelton, also a law enforcement retiree. I was 25 years at the Norman Police Department with Jennifer, and again, like her, I retired to come on into this position. So,
well, again, thank you all for being here tonight. I want to make a statement for everyone here tonight so that they understand our intent here. It's not our intention to offend anyone in any of the topics that we have this evening. We're not intent on establishing any absolutes. With this program or with anything else, this is a politically and emotionally charged topic. And it has a lot of opinions, probably as many as there are questions about it. So what we respectively offer is our thoughts and professional opinions on the subject, and we ask only that in return that you respect the rights of the people that are making statements, both from the panel and from the question and answers session afterward. We'll have a lengthy question and answer session planned into the event after we finish with our panel discussion. So if you would please hold your questions until then, and with that we'll go ahead and get started. So basically, Jennifer, or if you want to pass it off to either one of the Garys, what's the program about? Can you describe some of the content, the general practices, maybe what your target audience is?
Okay. Just a little bit of history on the Oklahoma School Security Institute. We were actually created in response to Sandy Hook. Lieutenant Governor Todd Land put together the School Security Commission that brought together subject matter experts to talk about how could we prevent something like what happened at Sandy Hook from happening here in Oklahoma. I will say that I think we're way ahead of the curve, ahead of a lot of states. They don't have anything like this, and we have schools or states that will contact us to find out how they can, put together something like the School Security Institute. Our target audience is really any school. We work with public and private schools. We work with technology centers. We have had community colleges. We've had universities that have reached out to us. Sometimes it may just be as something as simple as working on a tabletop exercise, but we're about customer service. If somebody needs our assistance, we're going to step up and help. We've talked with, we've actually sat on kind of a group that works on accreditation for child care centers, because they need to have plans as well. They have some very precious resources within their walls. Everything that we offer is free. We have our tip line, which is, I think, a very important part of the prevention end of everything that we do. There was a tip line that was funded by the State Department of Education a number of years ago, but it was very expensive and it was somewhat ineffective in just the way that the company handled it. Our tip line is actually run through the State Bureau of Investigation, and so there's never a time when somebody is going to call with a tip and have to leave a voicemail. They're going to be able to talk to somebody. That information at that time is going to be looked at and decided whether it needs to be, we need to wake people up in the middle of the night, or if it's something that just needs to be emailed out and let them handle it the way they see fit. And then I'll let the Garys kind of talk about additional training and things that we offer.
Primarily what I do are some of the trainings that I've focused on has been the armed or active assailant training in the schools. So at this point, I know last year I conducted about 17 different trainings for schools all over the state of Oklahoma. We're broke down into regions, so Gary has everything north of I-40, I have everything south of I-40.
I really got taken on that deal right there.
He wasn't at the office the day we made that decision, so. But I work on the active assailant training. I do trainings for the bus drivers. They're required each year to get a certain amount of hours to continue to keep their license to be able to drive their bus. One of the things that they get plenty of training on turn signals, stop bucks, railroad crossings, those things. But we work with the Oklahoma Association of Pupil Transportation. One of the things they didn't have was how to handle a parent who may be upset with the driver and has now gotten onto the bus and is threatening them or in a position of threatening the children. So that's something that we developed and we've been working with them on. We perform security assessments for the schools. Did you touch on that?
I did not.
Okay, so we do security assessments for the schools. We travel around all the schools and that. We get there, we talk with their staff, we talk with their superintendents, their principals, some of their teachers, to find out what their procedures are as far as how it relates to security practices, intruder and lockdown drills. Then from that point, we'll start a physical assessment of their building itself to address their entryway, what type of access control do they have at their schools, how many doors do they have unlocked, and just the physical aspects of the building. We generate a report for them at that point and give that to them so that they have something to look at and to work towards maybe improving the safety and security of their school. And again, that's all free, I guess, is the main point. So. And
one of the other things to point out is we know that tonight is somewhat focused on what happened in Florida, but we really take a multi-hazard approach. We understand that schools deal with much, much more, that there's always the possibility, but the probability is probably pretty low. So we like to talk with schools about what's already happening in their schools. A non-custodial parent trying to pick up a child. A simple parent-teacher conference that seemed to be going fine, and then suddenly a parent is out of control. So we want to make sure that we're focusing on what's already happening in those buildings.
Gary, you want to talk a little bit about our REMS, our Emergency Operations Plan?
One of the trainings that we're offering now, and we try to offer it regularly, is emergency management planning for schools. And we partnered with the State Department of Education to travel around the state, certain locations, bringing schools together to help them develop comprehensive, inclusive emergency operation plans for a multitude of hazards, not just violent intruders, but other threats. And that's specific to school size. And to give you an example, if you were from Mangum, you might look at your list of threats and say, rattlesnakes is something we need to be pretty concerned about down here. Yeah. They're on the football field, they're on the baseball field. How do we deal with that? How do we handle those kind of situations? But looking at that as an example, just an all-inclusive report. And what Gary was talking about when we do risk and vulnerability assessments, one of the classes that we teach education professionals and is in high demand is what I call the top 10 things you can do to keep your school safe. And that's really a result of doing assessments across the state, and you see consistently the same issues over and over and over again. So we took the top 10 and said, look, these things continue to be a problem for us and a challenge for you. We want to show you how you can resolve these issues, and we want to tell you why this is important. And looking back on past events, past critical incidents, what can we learn from those things? So that's one of the trainings that we offer, and educators seem to be very engaged and appreciate it.
Absolutely. In fact, we were in Oklahoma City just yesterday.
And I don't know how many school districts, but I know we had
some private schools as well as public schools in that training. And I think probably one of the parts that really brings that together is working with the State Department of Education. They bring in the idea of creating a crisis team, but the reality is a crisis team can't really exist if they don't have a plan to follow. And so we came together with that training, and it has been very, very well received. I think last year I think we had about 150 school districts that we served through that training with over 700 people attending. Now, one of the other big things, when I first started with the School Security Institute, these guys came on just a few months after me, is our director, Kim Carter, said, assist with our School Resource Officer Association, which was brand new in Oklahoma. We are huge advocates for school resource officers in schools. We understand that they are so much more than just having law enforcement in school. It's about building relationships with students. It's about having that security that can be very, very vital. But the mentoring, the getting to know the kids, understanding that law enforcement is a partner. And so we work very well with them. And we work every year to help fund their conference. We work to make sure that we're bringing in training that's relevant to those school resource officers, and we have some amazing officers in our schools throughout the state.
Excellent. Thank you very much for all of that. So it sounds like you've been around the state fairly well and seen every different kind of school there could be, from rural to metropolitan. Yes. So one of the statements that I heard recently in the discussion was that a lot of the schools in Oklahoma, in fact probably the United States, were built in the 1950 to 1970 era. And school shooter scenarios weren't even part of design. Right. It wasn't even a consideration. So as they're poorly arranged for prevention or response, which I believe you touched on, what few items would you suggest to any of the schools that they could do in order to maximize what they have as far as the infrastructure already for prevention and response?
Well, one of the things that we try and talk with them about is we understand that best practice recommendations often take a lot of money. And we understand that they're short on that. And so we try and say, okay, if we can't meet best practice recommendations, let's, for instance, and we've talked about access control. If you currently have 10 doors that are unlocked, do we have the ability of at least locking half of those and then putting teachers by those doors when they have to be unlocked during passing period because they're moving among several buildings on campus.
That's one of the recommendations. But we see schools that were built back in the 1950s that are doing amazing jobs, and we see schools that are brand new that missed out on some security specifications that could have really helped. But I'm going to let them talk about some of the schools that they've worked with where they've seen things that have really worked.
Okay.
Typically what you see is we try to focus on the entry points, the primary entry points. As you said, a lot of the older schools were not developed where they have what we would call man-catcher system,
right.
The double lobby. The ability to control the main access point is kind of critical. So we kind of focus on that. And let me say this, when we go in, it doesn't do me any good to come in and do a risk assessment for a school and say, here's what you need to do, and it's going to cost you a lot of money.
Right.
Because there is none. And they don't have it, or it's going to have to be a bond-supported program. So what we look at is, here's a recommendation for you compared to best practice standard. If funding becomes available, this is what we would recommend. If funding is not available, you need to look for some alternatives. Can we change a procedure? Can we institute a different protocol? Can we minimize doors? Can we provide better oversight? So some of the things that we look for are alternatives to improving safety and security. But primarily what we look at in a building design is how many of the doors can we close? How many can we minimize for use, and can we do a better job of monitoring who's getting in and out of the building?
And along those lines, we've also, here's of late, I've been getting a lot of phone calls from schools that have passed bond issues. And so they're looking for those ideas of what to do on their schools. And so we still try and work in the low cost to no cost realm for them. But like Gary and Jennifer both said, it's access control. I mean, that's where it all starts. And security comes in layers. It's going to come in layers. So if we can control the point that they're getting into the school, then that's a start. We also make the recommendations of what are you doing inside your school? Are you locking your classroom doors while you're teaching? Are you securing classrooms that aren't occupied at the time? Because especially in an elementary, just if you're an elementary teacher, how fast can a little one get hidden? They can get hidden really quick. And so those are, you might overlook them if you're doing an evacuation or something and they've gotten to a point that you didn't know where they were. So that will really start messing with your reunification process. So those are just some of the things we talked to them about is locking doors, locking their interior doors, exterior doors, controlling those points of access. Another big component for me that I think about is my staff itself that's inside the school. And we try and work on, in this report, or I try and touch on the awareness of the staff. If staff sees somebody on campus, do they feel comfortable making contact with that person and saying, hey, have you been to our office? You need to go check into the office. Here's our procedures. And because oftentimes people who are there, they run through processes where they may be, for lack of a better term, casing the place or probing and breaching. They're looking to see how easy do I have access to this, who's watching me, who's paying attention. So we try and touch on that component as well, as far as here's what your staff should be doing to bolster your security that much more.
Excellent. Jennifer, you happen to mention that there were older schools that were doing great things, and some of the other schools that have missed a few things. In general, from all that you've seen in the reports that you've seen, how well prepared are the schools in Oklahoma right now for an active shooter incident?
Our schools are doing a wonderful job with the resources that they have. They understand where their shortcomings are. The fact that they're reaching out to us is very, very important.
I think they're doing a better job with drills. Realistically, and we all say this anytime we do training, is you play the game in the way that you practiced. If you don't practice well, you're probably not going to play well. And so when we talk to schools about doing drills, we're talking to them about making sure that drills are being done in a way that is going to prepare faculty, staff, and students for an actual emergency. A few years ago, when the School Security Institute was first created, part of the change in the law is that drills had to be reported to our office. As drills were coming through email and fax, It was up to our staff to actually take every one of those drills and put it into our database. So I read every one of those drills. And at first what we would see is that schools were doing the drills almost as a check mark. And we would gently remind them that that's not a good plan, and really all you're doing is preparing your staff for chaos. And so through working with them, we understand they have many, many things to do. And so we're trying to work from an area of strength rather than always coming in and attacking them and telling them they're doing something wrong. Is we look and say, okay, you're doing this. Have you thought about doing this? And they've been very receptive to that. And so what we want to do is just continually work with them, let them know that those resources are available, and making sure that they are doing those drills in an effective manner. And I think they're doing a much better job on that, and it's a learning curve for everybody. But we encourage them to get their local law enforcement involved in it, any of their first responders, to give them kind of a preview as to what it would look like in case of an emergency.
Okay. Appreciate that. One of the programs that I've seen and in fact taught over the years is something that came out of Houston a few years ago called Run, Hide, Fight. And from what I'm seeing with the condition of the schools, with the inability to actually restrict someone from entry and things of that nature, and some of the discussions that I've seen on different threads and different websites, the recommendation might be to change that up a little and make it run, fight, and hide. And I'm just curious how your team feels about that thought and how well you think that would be received in Oklahoma.
I'm going to say just a couple words, and then I'm going to hand this over to Gary Shelton. Is that any options we consider to be good? Because right now, really, all that's happening is hide. And so we are tremendous advocates for run, hide, fight. But Gary does a really good job of when he teaches schools about the idea of they're not exclusive. One doesn't have to be done in order.
Right.
So I'll let Gary talk about that.
And that's exactly right. There's lots of programs out there right now that are coming online that are working with schools, and everybody has a way that they think everything should be done. Again, for me, I'm a big advocate of run, hide, fight. And when I do talk to schools, as Jennifer mentioned, to get them to understand that those aren't exclusive, because sometimes when you hear run, hide, fight, you hear, well, the first thing I got to do is run, then I got to hide, then I got to fight. So we try and work with schools and give them the options of run, hide, fight, avoid, deny, defend, whatever's out there. We don't, I guess, say there's one better than the other. Right. You got to have the best option. And what option might work for Norman High might not be an option that works for Poto, Oklahoma. So one option that might work for the high school is not going to work for the elementary school. So, but back when I talk about the run, hide, fight, I try and get them to understand that you may not have the option to run at that moment. You may have to lock your door and then figure out, okay, what plan B is if your door's not already locked. Is it that at that point they've said, the announcements came over the intercom, we have an intruder in the north hallway. Well, I know if I'm in the south hallway, maybe I do have that time that I can escape the building. I can run from the building. But if they tell me he's in the north hallway and I'm in the north hallway, that might not be a viable option for me at that time. I might have to hide until I can figure out what my next move is. Fight, again, every situation is going to be fluid. So for me, I would have to make the determination, if I'm a pre-K teacher or a kindergarten teacher, is that really a viable option for me at that particular time? I submit to you that it's probably not, to a degree. But if I were in a cafeteria and we have 300 kids in there, and that's where our armed assailant or our active assailant is, that might be my option. I don't have the option of run. I don't have the option of hiding. I may have to turn my attention to that person and go and take control of the situation.
Gary, you want to talk some about like the importance of communications in like plans for special needs kiddos?
Well, I do want to emphasize something here, that we're not talking about just what is good for individual school districts, but what's good for the individual. Something that education professionals have not typically done in management protocols is empower the individual to make individual decisions that's best for them. Based on your ability, based on where you're located in the building, based on what your students' abilities are, based on what you are facing, can you or do you feel empowered to make a decision that's the best for your group? Is running away the best? Is concealing or sheltering in place the best? Or are you going to have to fight depending on where you're at? Is that an option for you? And what's unique about educators, because my wife is one, is education professionals are concrete sequential people. They're rule followers. They like to follow the rules. They demonstrate that not only in their lives but to their kids on how to follow the rules. So what's the rule? When the principal initiates the lockdown, then that's what we do. And we don't think outside that because we haven't been told to. So what we're training people to do and training administrators to do is to think about how do you empower your people to make the decision that's best for them. For instance, if I've got a room full of autistic kids, is it conceivable that I am going to be able to run away with a group that's physically challenged? We've got kids who are on IEPs that because they're physically challenged with walkers or with wheelchairs. That's just not going to be an option. So what is the best for you? And we empower. I always tell this story because I think it's really good. I did an assessment where I asked the cafeteria manager, if you had an armed assailant in the cafeteria, what would you do? And she said, well, I don't know. We've never talked about that. I guess I'd just take everybody to the back of the kitchen. I said, well, right here's a double glass door in your cafeteria, and I can look across the street, and there's the police department. There's police cars over there. Could you just take the kids and run over there? She said, oh, no, I couldn't do that. I'd have to ask. So when you talk to people who have been conditioned to ask permission first, we need to get out of that mode and say, listen, you may make a mistake in a choice, but we believe that you are capable and effective in making a decision that's best for you and your kids, and we encourage you to do that.
I appreciate your segue there because you almost took me right into my next question, and I was hoping you would say, well, I just tell the kids to start throwing food at him, because one of the premier trainers on self-defense in the workplace and in businesses talks about distracting the assailant by pummeling them with whatever's not nailed down. An interesting side story to that is, at one time working in the state EOC, we had a short in the ceiling. And if any of you have ever heard an electrical short, it sounds a lot like a gunfire. It's a real loud pop. Well, 4 or 5 of us were in a briefing room having a briefing when the pop happened, and 2 other people were in the command section of where the director and the assistant director sit. And to the person, all of us came into the main area with a weapon of some sort in our hand. Understand, there are no weapons allowed in the state EOC. So we made fun of one individual who came out with their stapler, but you have to understand, the idea is, what can you use when you're up against the wall, when it's the crucial moment? Your thoughts on whether you actually can make some change in the situation by picking up whatever's laying around and throwing it at the assailant.
We are advocates for options. Whatever that fight looks like is whatever that's going to be. Whether it's, I mean, you can use whatever. If you're fighting for your life, then there's really no limit. But when the shooting happened in Parkland, Florida, probably almost everybody in here watched the video of the kids who were taking shelter in a locked classroom where the bad guy did not get in, and they are Snapchatting it, and you're listening to the gunfire, and you see how those kids are reacting. I did not see any of them looking for a weapon. But that goes back to something that Gary teaches, and I want you to expand on that, is that your body will not go where your mind has not been.
Exactly.
And so I don't know that we do not teach kids how to fight. That is something that a school district, that's their level. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, that's the reason why we talk about the options.
Right.
But I want Gary to expand on that.
And that is something, I talk to the teachers, I try and give them scenario-based situations and tell them to think through them, and then think through them, not obsess about them, but if they have free time during the day, to think through what would I do during a parent-teacher conference if I had an irate parent with me. What does that look like? And so at the moment, because we're all human, we go through a fight, flight, or freeze response. So what I may react to as a trained person, being a former police officer, may be different than what somebody else would react to. I may hear something and go, ooh, that sounds like a gunshot. Whereas another person may say, what was that? Did somebody drop something? So you get into that kind of mode. So I try and have them run through those just to prepare their mind, because there is that moment of pause where something catches you and it causes you to freeze. And back to what I think I go back to when you were talking about throwing the food and throwing things, and I just want to echo what Gary said. It's got to be something that you're prepared for, ready for, but it's something that is best for you and for your students. And realize that you may not have that opportunity, you may have to go in fight mode, but if I do have my kindergarten class, ahead of time I'm thinking, okay, is fighting really an option for my class?
Right.
Is throwing a box of crayons from my kids really an option? And how long do I have to sustain that fight? How long do I have to sustain that? Because at some point you're going to run out of things to throw eventually. And so, you know, I may look at a different option. My door's locked, that may be where now I'm looking to get out of the building. Versus if I'm in the high school and I see the senior quarterback who's going to go to the University of Oklahoma. Any of you fans in here? All right. Yeah. Boomer, all right, Sooner. So my options become different for me at that point. If I have the young lady sitting there that's a softball, she's the pitcher on my softball team, and I have my football players, and I have some big people, my options do change at that point, so that might be a viable option for me, where I would consider at that point, yeah, we're going to throw things so I can get them out of their cycle and we can go on the attack.
Right, exactly.
But the other thing
it's knowing your room, knowing what you have.
One of the things that we talk about is, and if you think about that, if I asked you if you were in a locked classroom, a locked room in your home, and you knew that there was fire on the other side, how would you get out of your room? If there was a window, would we break the window and get out? We kind of have that same option if there's a bad guy shooting a gun on the other side of that door. So like I said, it's thinking through the options. It's not just sticking with that one thing. But yeah, if it comes down to fighting, all bets are off.
But it's a process that the schools have to acknowledge and decide whether they're going to talk that, teach that, or not.
Right.
Exactly.
Right.
And a different kind of option, we've all pretty much agreed, and I think it's no secret that funding for any programs like these are grossly unavailable. And with barring any new legislature that provides us a sudden windfall of money to have every possible school security program we ever wanted, what local contacts or programs can schools turn to in their local communities that might offer them some kind of mutual aid or training or support?
Well, working with their local first responders, making sure that they're familiar with them, making sure that if something is going on in the community that could possibly affect the school, that they have a relationship with those first responders, and they're going to think to, hey, we probably need to notify the schools. We've talked with some folks, some schools who said, I knew something was going on because the news helicopter was over our school, but we had no other information besides that. So we need to make sure that communication is key, and we've learned that. I mean, in emergency management, usually the first thing that goes is communication.
Exactly.
And it could be a communication failure due to loss of electricity, but many times it's a communication failure from within. We're not talking to each other. We're not, we haven't planned for it. We don't have redundancy so that if our PA system goes out, do we have that secondary, do we have text messages? Do we have radios? You know, what are the options? If there is a problem inside the school and we need to keep kids out, can those folks that are already outside hear that announcement? So there's a lot of different things that have to do with the safety and security of our students.
Okay. So
I think also too, Big Jen mentioned law enforcement. We've got some law enforcement guys here. I think law enforcement at some we too are going to have to get better at going out and contacting our schools and working with our schools, and that's coming. We're seeing that now. We're seeing officers doing that, and I'll just give you my history at the Norman Police Department. I was a lieutenant in patrol, and I look back on my career, and I think if I would have done things differently, it probably would have been we would have had more contact with our school. We just didn't. I came from a standpoint of our schools do a wonderful job of educating our kids and taking care of everything that needs to be done. So they got this under control. That frees me up to take all the other stuff that's going on in Norman. So I think that has to be a group effort. You know, we can tell the teachers reach out to your first responders, but I think too we're going to have to start seeing them reach out for them, and most are now. We saw that, realized that, and what we started doing at Norman was another lieutenant came up with the idea of adopt a school. So all of our guys that were on our division, every one of them had schools they were assigned to, and they had to go to those schools twice a month, 3 times a month, however, you know, depending on the number of schools. And then they had to report back to us. Here's the schools I went to. Here's who I talked to. Here's what I did. Now, at first there was a little resistance, as some things happen.
Change.
But after a while, our guys actually enjoyed it. They started going out. We were finding they were reading to the students. They were knowing who the librarian was. But here's the critical point of that. We had our officers in the schools. Safety and security. The time you have an emergency event, that officer, that's not the first time he needs to be going into that school, because Midwest City schools are large, Norman schools are large, Oklahoma City schools are large. So there's a payoff there that if he has to go into that school, he knows the layout of the school. So that was a resource for me as a supervisor. I knew I had officers in the school. If something happened, they can tell me, we've got 4 hallways that go this way, 2 hallways this way, and so that really, I think, improved our ability to respond to an event more rapidly. It would help us in managing that event from that standpoint.
And that's, we talk with schools about the importance of bringing law enforcement into their schools. We said offer them a hot cup of coffee or a cold bottle of water, a desk to do paperwork on, have them come in and read to your kids, attend assemblies. There's a million ways to get them involved with your school that doesn't necessarily have to rise to the point of a school resource officer that we know can be expensive. But I think that's a very important relationship.
Excellent. So with all the law enforcement experience we have sitting here at the table, I'm going to ask you to put 2 hats on at the same time. And one is look at things from the school security aspect, and the other from law enforcement. And this is going to be one of those touchy subjects that you knew we were going to eventually get to. I don't advocate arming every teacher, but for those who want to be prepared, what are your thoughts on teachers with firearms in classrooms if they're properly vetted with a serious background check, which means what? Properly trained, and it's beyond just the basic concealed carry permit, maybe CLEAT or even higher level than that, and properly certified and recertified like most security and law enforcement personnel are required to go through. Is there really a feasible process in all of that? And how do you support the idea, and if so, how did the schools make it happen?
2 years ago, the state legislature allowed school boards to decide if they wanted to arm school staff. And there were certain qualifications that had to be met in order to allow that to happen. What our job is to do is to support that. And so we created some policy and procedure recommendations, some things to ponder, if you will, for school boards that were in the process of making that decision. So that's where ours, kind of where our background come from. But I want Gary to talk about one of the things that we did shortly after that is did a couple of classes at one of the state conferences for COSA, the Cooperative Council of School Administrators. And I think he can give you some background on that.
Looking at this issue when it was passed, we knew it was coming, so we needed to be prepared to help schools implement it. For those schools that made that decision, we needed to be prepared for that and assist. So looking at this from the standpoint from law enforcement, let's make a comparison. The law requires that the school board pass a policy that approves this practice. What does a policy look like for a school? Most schools have no idea. But to give you an idea, from the Tulsa Police Department, from where I retired, the deadly force policy, or the use of force policy, was about 7 pages long. Well, don't expect a school to have a 7-page use of force policy, but using that as a guide, you could say it needs to be more than just a couple of lines. So let's look at what we could do to help schools develop a good, sound policy that made the implementation of arming teachers effective and safe. How do we keep everybody safe? How do you make it effective? So we did presentations with or through the State Department of Education, and we still offer that training to schools to say, if you are considering this, and we know that the law requires that you have a policy, let us help you develop good policy, because good policy not only makes it safer for everyone, it lowers risk, it lowers liability. So we cover as many topics as we can to help you develop good policy.
And one of the things that we encourage is obviously working with law enforcement. You know, we know that we have school districts across the state in rural areas where they may be on the county line, so their closest law enforcement response is probably 45 minutes. We understand that. We want to make sure that we're doing everything that we can to support that. We have school districts who have 3 or 4 jurisdictions just within their school district. That's going to be a mess. That's going to be a different story. But what we want to do is say, you know, these are things to think about if you're considering it, and if you're going to go ahead with it, just as Gary said, make sure that we're supporting them policy and procedure-wise.
Super. Okay, one final topic, if I may, and you've touched on a little bit of this in several of what you've said, but in planning requirements and specifically telling the schools, here's the best way you can plan for not just a school shooter incident, but for an all hazards approach. Because it's like when the Center for Disease Control built a zombie apocalypse annex. Well, that's crazy to do that, but the idea is if you plan for the absolute worst case scenario, then everything else that happens, you've got covered.
Right.
So in the planning protocols, evacuation protocols, training for schools, you've mentioned those things. Multiple option evacuations, you've mentioned several times. Predetermined routes seem to be a big thing, a big recurrent theme that I see in a lot of literature about having more than one escape route and having walked them and seeing what the obstacles are and the hiding points are along the way. And then now, well, not now, but the November 14, 2014 law that required the schools to do more drills, the feasibility of using one of those drills specifically for this kind of scenario.
So I do want to say they were not required to do more drills. We did not want to add anything else to the school's plate. But when the School Security Commission was created, there was this talk about doing 2 intruder drills and 2 lockdown drills. But there was no guidelines or definitions as to what they considered that to be. Coming from a law enforcement background, to us it made a lot of sense. To schools it did not. And they were getting caught up in their definition versus what the state had. And so we were able to work just with some state legislators just to clear up some language and make it a little bit easier. So now instead of doing 2 security or 2 intruder and 2 lockdown, it's 4 security. So, and the idea behind that is practicing as if there's a problem inside your building or there's a problem outside. There are also these magic other categories, which we have schools that are practicing earthquake drills. Who would have ever thought we would have to do that in the state of Oklahoma? But those can be bus evacuation. It can be what we deem as reverse evacuation. How quickly can you get all of those kids back in a door, back into a certain area, because maybe you have an animal, a dangerous animal on your grounds, such as, because we really did have schools that created an annex around rattlesnakes. That did happen. But just making sure that we're practicing things that are kind of going to prepare us for those multi-hazard problems, recognizing that all of these things can work together in the long run. That if we're prepared for these different things, then everything else kind of comes together when we need it to be, regardless of what we call it,
Exactly.
regardless of what the problem is.
Exactly. So what sort of planning process do you encourage or recommend to the schools based on some of the topics we've talked about?
So are you talking about putting the emergency operations plan together?
Yes.
Okay, we use REMS, which is Readiness and Emergency Management for Schools program. It is based off of FEMA, and no offense to anybody who's been dealt with FEMA, but there's a lot of jibber jabber. I call it FEMA jibber jabber, and I mean that with the most respect. But it basically, they took a 2.5-day class and put it down into a 4-hour class, which is much more, it's much more likely that schools are going to be able to commit to that time. And that's part of that crisis team training that Gary referred to with the State Department of Education, is we give them this classroom time, and then we stay around with them to offer to work with them on their plan. A lot of schools have what they call a critical incident flip chart. We call it kind of your oh my, something bad is going wrong chart. You know, and it flips.
Okay, you cleaned that up.
I did. Anyway. And the idea behind that is just giving you that quick reference guide. And those things are very, very, very useful in the classroom. Not necessarily something, it doesn't cover before, during, and after, which is what a good plan covers. About what do we do, you know, the crisis doesn't end when the good guys come in and stop whatever's happening. That you have response, you have recovery, and recovery can be very, very long term. So how do you continue class? If, you know, look at Moore Public Schools back in 2013, they got permission to end their school year because they were very close to the end of the school year. But if something happened in February, where are we going to hold classes? And thinking about the resiliency, continuation of operations plans.
Not to mention reunification, which can be another disaster in its own.
Absolutely, yeah. Absolutely.
All right, well, panelists, Jennifer, Gary, and Gary, thank you very much for spending the time here to answer questions for me. What I'd like to do now is open it up to the audience, and anyone who has a question of the panelists, if you would just signify by raising your hand, someone has a microphone somewhere, and they'll be happy to bring it to you and let them ask a question. Don't all raise your hand at once now.
There you go.
Hi, I wanted to ask a question. My daughter attends Moore High School, and they have had strangers on the campus before, made the evening news and all that. Their campus is an older campus, and there's a lot of walking outdoors,
yes.
The kids. So you don't have a lot of teachers outside, but I guess my question is, you talk to administrators, and you talk to staff, and you talk to teachers. What kind of program do you have for the kids that are walking outside the campus every day on a school like that, or any school, really? What kind of program? I know they have the See Something, Say Something campaign, and I've heard a lot about that.
Yep.
But I wanted to know what you specifically, how you focus on educating the actual youth about what to look for and how to respond in those situations.
You want to talk about the Moore Prep Rally?
Yes, and Moore has put together a prep rally, which was actually a really neat thing. They had a student 2 years ago who was looking at safety and security for their school, and he put together an 8-hour day where he had different people come in from the police department, fire department, emergency management, emergency services. We were there, and so all the kids would come to us, and we would talk about those very things, to see something, say something. I touched on the thing with kids is, what we see in school, there's a code of silence. Sometimes things are happening, and they're not going to talk about it. So that's kind of what I hit them with, was talking about, if you see something, you need to let an adult know. As far as statewide, that is something we're starting to do. We haven't really, at this point, we've just been touching on staffs and trying to get them up to speed. I've got several lined out where I'm fixing to go start introducing these ideas to the students. Fort Supply is one, and Navajo Public Schools is one, where I'll go out and address the kids just for that very, very topic you're talking about.
Can I ask you a question? I'm assuming, is this elementary age?
No, this is high school.
High school?
Yeah.
The state law requires that every school has a safe school committee. We encourage schools to include students as part of the safe school committee. Not only are you required to have it, they're required to meet, which was not the case prior to the safety commission that we had. We had a safe school committee requirement. There was no requirement that it ever met. Now there is. We really want to see students as a part of the Safe School Committee, and to bring up those topics, to say this is something that concerns us. We found that if you listen to kids, they'll tell you where the problems are, and they'll probably give you some advice on how to solve it.
Absolutely.
Let's get a microphone over here for you now.
So that goes to a question that I have as far as how do you get the feedback from the kids? Because I'll be honest, my daughter is a freshman at Midwest City High School. She attended Moore, and she was at Briarwood when 2013 happened. So, you know, she's had a different background of training, so to speak. But with regard to like an active shooter scenario, when I talk to her about the issue, I'm not clear that she has an understanding on what she's supposed to do or what anyone else is really supposed to do. And so I understand your programs are working with the school districts and throughout the state, and I commend you all. I think that's fantastic. And I do think that Oklahoma is ahead of the curve. I really do. And so I appreciate that. But how do you get the audit, so to speak, feedback from the kids? I mean, I understand, you know, your reference to a safe school committee, but just call into the tip line?
That's some of it, but also too, I would tell you, that's got to be a part of the culture of your school. And so right now what we're seeing is we're trying to move that culture and change that culture, and it's unfortunate that we're having to make that part of our culture now in our schools. As far as that's something we have to be aware of. We all in this room, and I've heard it 50 million times from my friends, well, I never worried about that when I was in school. I won't date myself, but we never had these issues when I was in school. Our issues were totally different. And so that's a culture change. And for the teachers, we're encouraging the teachers to have that conversation with the kids. I think that's got to start inside the school too, with that conversation taking place from the teachers to the students. So when you talk about know what to do, I'm assuming you're talking about know what to do when that day, if that day comes, correct?
Yes. Yes.
So a good example of that is, especially with the drill processing or doing the drills, we know that works. We saw it at Sandy Hook. In Miss Soto's room, she was the second room that we know this gentleman went into, the shooter, and there were kids in that room who were lined up by the door. For whatever reason, he stopped firing. We don't know if he went into a weapon malfunction or if he was reloading, but whatever process happened, he stopped. These kids had enough presence of mind and remembered having, I think, the conversation with their teacher, get out. And they exited the school, and if you remember, those were the ones that were found at the fire department that had went to a local fire department. That goes back to I think Miss Soto had that conversation with her kids during their drill processes and worked through that with them and built that plan in that room.
And she didn't say, if a bad guy comes into the classroom and he's shooting, this is what to do. What she recognized is bad things happen at inconvenient times. And so there may be a substitute teacher in the room. She may have stepped out of the room for a moment and something happens. And so she was just preparing them, empowering them, if you will. But we, you know, as parents, folks, ask your kids about the drills that they're participating in. Talk to them about it. I have a foreign exchange student living with me right now. And she's in high school. And I always ask her how her day went. And she talked about, well, today we did some drills. And she said one of them, she is from Chile. And she said, we did a hurricane drill. And I said, okay, a tornado drill, you know, and where they went, and that went well. Well, then apparently later on that day, they practiced a lockdown drill. The understanding is that everybody in the room understood what they were supposed to be doing, what was going on. She had no clue. She listened to what the teacher told her to do, but she didn't have any idea why she was doing it. And so I think that needs to be an ongoing conversation, making sure kids are clear, making sure that they're listening to the leaders in their school. Several years ago in Norman, we had an incident where we had some workers get away from a working group out of jail, and they happened to be, ended up very close to a middle school. And my daughter, during this point, we, as officers, we were all assigned to particular schools. My daughter at the point, obviously she's concerned. Every school in Norman is going on lockdown. And I just kept on repeating, listen to what your teacher says. I have all the faith in the world that those teachers are going to do everything that they can to keep my kiddo safe. And so we have to support the schools. We have to support them.
We can do that through the Safe Schools Committee.
But talk to your kids about the drills that they're doing. Find out what their concerns are. And folks, bring it up with your administration. Hey, I was talking with my kiddo, and I feel like they don't really understand why they're doing these drills. And like I said, I don't know. I think age-appropriate conversations need to happen. We want to be careful about creating a bunch of paranoid folks. We want to make sure that they're aware of the situation without creating paranoia.
Can I ask one follow-up?
Oh, of course.
So one of the issues that I'm interested in seeing happen, and I'm curious if y'all do this, is doing like a town hall type meeting where between school administration, our police department, even our city and our emergency response folks come out and they talk in an open forum to parents, so that way the parents are getting it, because with any kids, there's something lost in translation. Maybe you hear what's happening, maybe you don't, but sort of like there's a chance for the parents to get direct training. Is there also resources or anything like that that you suggest, or do you all do any training like that where you go out and you set those up and you talk to the parents about this is what's going to happen, and so that we can then have more informed conversations with the kiddos on the backside?
We have not done that, and this is my opinion. I'll let the Garys kind of share their opinion. That conversation needs to be happening locally. It doesn't mean that we won't, if it's possible for all three of us, you know, for us to be there, we will support it, we will encourage it, but it's not something that we would be in charge of. We need our law enforcement partners to, you know, to be talking. There needs to be that honest conversation between the school, the community, and law enforcement and other first responders. And I don't think that starts with the Oklahoma School Security Institute. Is that a fair statement?
Are you going to have free food?
No, Gary.
I'm there.
Feed them and they will come.
Well, I will say that I have had a conversation with Chief Blakes behind me,
Okay.
Our mayor, because I serve on the city council, and Dr. Coffin on the way in here today.
Okay.
And they all are already moving in that direction.
Very good.
I couldn't give enough compliments to our leadership with Chief Blakes and the Midwest City Police Department. So, you know, I appreciate that. I was just curious if, you know, I hate to reinvent a wheel. So
Right.
you all already have that wheel in process.
Maybe you guys can be the start of that wheel.
We really have not been involved in town hall meetings. And I want to emphasize this because we keep bringing this back. We really want local law enforcement. I had a call the other day from the chief of police of a small community. He said, hey, can you come talk to my kids? Sure I can, but let me tell you what would be better. It would be better if you did. And here's what I tell teachers and I'm telling students. When the crisis comes, I'm not the guy coming to save your life. He is. You need to establish a relationship with him and his people. They need to be in the schools. I'm glad to come and talk to you. I'm glad to come and emphasize and endorse certain things. But when I'm done, I'm gone. These are the people that are coming to save your life. Build that relationship with them.
I have a question for you all. I don't need a microphone. We have our school superintendent here, Dr. Cobb, and his health information specialist, and they're very savvy with social media. Are you talking about intelligence gathering information with your different school districts that you go speak to? In other words, what I'm asking is there any programs you're encouraging school districts to monitor Facebook, Snapchat, Instagram to gather the information that may prevent some type of intruder or shooting? Because they're very good at it, but I know we don't do it. But are you encouraging that at the school district level?
Using any tools available to you. One of the, at the National Association of School Resource Officer Conference this past summer, we had the opportunity, and I can't remember if you went in there, there was a program. It was basically social threat assessment through social media, and we would be very interested to bring them to the state of Oklahoma and do some regional trainings because and everything legal, absolutely above board, but you know, we know that kids put it all out there. It is there for us to see. We just have to make sure that we see it. So no, we encourage any way for information to be gathered legally with, within policies and procedures within the law to absolutely do that. But it takes time, and it takes expertise in some cases. I mean, if somebody gave that to me, I don't have Snapchat. I don't know how to search it. But those are the types of trainings we want to bring to Oklahoma. We want to bring some threat assessment courses. I know that Gary Reddick had put together some threat assessment information when he was the Tulsa Public Schools police chief. And I'd like him to talk about some of that, because I think sometimes we miss some of those clues. But then there's the issue where we see the clues and we're not doing anything with it. And I think that's an issue. You want to talk about your threat assessment?
Chief, we did, when I was at TPS, we did monitor Facebook. We actually created some false profiles, not in order to communicate with kids, but in order to monitor. We stopped a couple of suicide attempts, and we stopped a lot of fights. Because if you are monitoring Facebook and social media, kids are talking. When someone says, kids don't talk, folks, they're talking, they're just not talking to us. So if you're listening and you're searching for those, the issue then becomes, do you have the time? Who does it? Do you have the software to do it? And that's very difficult. It's difficult for schools to do that. So what we're really dependent upon is when the conversation is going on out there in social media or otherwise, that someone's reporting it. This last case, you look at the Parkland case, is consistent with other violent events we've had, not just in schools, but in malls and theaters and a lot of other places where people are doing mass killings. The process of behavioral threat assessment is one that's not new. It came about as after Columbine, the Secret Service report that was joined with the National Education Association recommended behavioral threat assessments to be conducted. It is the only program or concept that is pre or preventive in nature. We get caught up in a discussion of creating safe schools by looking at more guns, less guns in schools, arming people, not arming, and then mental health. And we forget there's a third component here, because both of those are really after. Mental health is not really even before. It's not effective in some respects. What we're looking at is, if you look at the Parkland case, take this Parkland case. The media has done a great job for us here. They did a post-behavioral threat assessment. They interviewed witnesses, they interviewed neighbors, they got police reports, they got police information, they got school administrators and psychologists, and they brought it all together. And when you looked at it, you would say to yourself, this is a no-brainer. Why didn't somebody do something here? This is so obvious that this kid was in trouble. Well, what if you had that information before? Would that help you to provide intervention services and stop it? Well, it certainly would. But nobody's looking at it before. But that's really not true either. Because if you look at some of the school districts in this country that have practiced for decades behavioral threat assessment, Los Angeles Unified School District is one of them. The largest school district in California, the second largest in the country. And they have a tremendous gang problem. And yet, you don't see mass shootings there, and they deflect, deter, and deny these opportunities for kids to create violent environments through behavioral threat assessment. So that's a product of something that we need to be looking at in this state and in others to implement. How do we teach and train to assess and share information cumulatively? How do we get it? How do we assess it? And then how do we intervene in it to stop these things from happening before they ever get too far off the grid?
I might add to that, one of the other uses of social media, especially post-event, are for the schools to host something, a website that the students can post to without any censorship, so that what the schools can now see is what's being posted on social media anyway. It's just not something that the schools are seeing. Mm-hmm. And making that available to the students gives them the ability to intervene in situations that occur where you may have secondary incidents that are prompted by the first one.
One of the things that we've learned, and to your question, I think I want to kind of help you here with something, if this will help you. Whenever I was at TPS, every year we would take the top 10 or 12 kids from every high school. So there's 9 high schools. We'd have over 100 kids that were the leaders, if you want to call them that, of the school. We'd bring them in, we'd ask this question: what would you do to make your school safer? What concerns you? How would you improve safety and security? And every year, the answers were pretty much the same. They didn't want to see more armed security guards. They didn't want to see dogs. They didn't want to see razor wire. They didn't want to see metal detectors, and they didn't want moats with alligators. That's not what they wanted. What they said was, you know what really makes us feel safe? It's culture. Am I appreciated? Am I valued? Does somebody care about me? Am I connected? Are we all moving the same direction? That's what they said over and over and over. So when you look at this component, and this is something that we teach when we teach administrators and faculty, is build the right culture. If you have a positive, healthy culture, you prevent problems, not just mass shootings, but fights and drugs and all the other issues that kids have to deal with today. Culture means more to kids than anything else. Does somebody care about me here? That's what they want to know.
Anyone else?
Uh-oh.
There's a couple of questions over here.
This is actually not a question. Can I make a statement?
Well, of course.
I'm going to be careful here. I've got people who know me. I have to speak the truth. My name is Andy Fugit. I'm actually an attorney, and I have the privilege of working with school districts. Those are my clients. And the reason I want to say something is maybe say something slightly positive. I spend my day talking to school administrators. Some of them are actually in this room, thankfully. And what I wanted to share is an experience I had 2 weeks ago. I think it was the day after Parkland. I got a phone call from a superintendent, I won't say where, it wasn't one in this room, who had a report from a student that day that they'd heard initially via social media about a fellow student that was threatening physical harm to classmates. Was going to come to school and shoot up the school. And it was initially reported to another adult from one of the students who saw it on Snapchat and then heard about it to an adult in the community who then reported it to the school and who immediately called the superintendent, and law enforcement was called immediately, and the student was actually detained within a few hours. And my point for saying this, that's not an isolated call that I've got.
No, not at all.
It's happening.
Mm-hmm.
And unfortunately in the media we hear terrible things. But the good news is, and I've been doing this 18 years, and we haven't had a mass incident in the time I've been doing this. I've been practicing law a lot longer than that. I wanted people to have some confidence that the educators in this room and lots of other places have a lot of, that they could use more. And I've heard a lot of good things. In fact, I sent you an email while I was sitting here.
Okay.
Because I have a question for you, and I'll share, want to get an answer off the record, so to speak. Nothing secret, but I need some advice from you. But the good things are happening. Mm-hmm. A lot of good things. We need to do more. We obviously need more money to make it happen. I'm going to stop with that.
And I do want you to walk away with, and I think I've said that out loud, but I want to say it again. Our schools are doing tremendous things with the resources that they have. They're very aware of where their gaps are, and they continue to reach out to ask for help on that. They are doing a great job. We know that there are many, nobody has ever reported on prevention. And I'm not blaming the media. It's not anything like that. I mean, it's, when I was a Norman police officer and crime prevention was my thing, nobody could pin me down of how many crimes have you prevented. I have no idea. But what we know is we do have a lot of people talking, and they're reporting things, and many things have been stopped. Kids have been helped when they needed the help, and we want to make sure that we're continuing that direction.
Would you indulge me in one more comment?
Sure.
I'm a lawyer, and that microphone that goes wild. These situations, and everybody knows this, they are incredibly complex. And administrators, school administrators, that's who I talk to. Generally, it's been a long, if they have a problem, it's a long-term problem. Mm-hmm. Educators have to follow the law in terms of how they respond
right.
to discipline. And are you thinking, hey, if I suspend Johnny or Sally, are they going to do something? But they're very complex. Educators have tough jobs to do. I'm not just trying to defend, they don't need me to defend them. But when we see a media report, the media gives you a couple of paragraphs or 30 seconds on TV, people think it's an easy answer. And rarely is the answer easy. I just want folks to think about that. Thank you. I'm not being paid for being here, by the way.
Okay.
We appreciate him being here. I'm a school board member, but I also spent 22 years as a school administrator. I chased kids for a living.
Okay.
And I appreciated what Gary said about his 10 kids from each of the schools and what they said they wanted. And as long as a school is trying to do just that, it really does stop a lot of things. But my concern right now is the number of young people around our state and the nation that are kind of copycat. They're writing notes or they're putting something on Facebook. And we need to do some brainstorming as to how do we let these kids know, hey, you're doing this to yourself if you do it. And I know you probably don't have the magic wand that can come up with an answer.
I wish I did.
But do you have anything that can be put out to the public, since you represent the whole state, to let our student body or anybody know what the consequences are for doing something like this, because it's a felony?
I think that has to come, again, from the local level. It needs to come from the district. It needs to come from the local law enforcement. But again, so much of that are relationships that are built in those hallways and in the classrooms and talking. And some of it is they really just don't understand the consequences. And it's partly because their brains aren't completely developed until what, they're like 25 years old. So kind of that whole consequence thing is beyond them at that point. But I do wish that I had the magic answer for that, but I don't. I mean, but it takes a community. We, not only parents, but it's, we've all talked about that when we were raised, there were lots of people who were in charge of us. It wasn't just one group. And so the more that we can support families, the more that we can support our teachers, we support these kids, I think we could possibly see a change in that.
As a previous education professional, you tell me, do you think it would help if we asked the State Department of Education to blast that statute out that says making a terrorist threat is a felony, and said, let's get this out to the schools and say, would you please have this discussion in your schools?
It wouldn't hurt. It wouldn't hurt to go to Channel 9, Channel 4, Channel 6, and say, hey.
4, 5, and 9.
Let these young people know that, hey, doing something like saying, I'm going to come to school and blow people away, just even in a joking way, has serious, serious consequences.
Yeah, because I'm really not sure that even some adults understand that statute, because that statute originally was created after 9/11. It was intended to be about making terrorist threats related to a terror attack. We've expanded the scope of that statute to include this issue now. And so I take what you're saying. Maybe if we work through SDE to get that out to schools and say, can you effectively and intelligently talk about this at the school level? And we have a newsletter, a monthly newsletter. Maybe we can put that in our newsletter to put that out as well, to say, listen, here's the statute, and this is what you need to know, and please tell your kids this is a felony that could follow them for quite some time in their life. This could be a life-changing event for them.
That doesn't just start at 15. I mean, we're having some of these calls being made by kids 10, 11 years old.
Right.
Yeah, an example of that, my sister's a school teacher, and she just reached out to me Monday, it was, and that on Friday they had found a note at their school. It had been damp and rained on, but they could make out certain words, and one of those words was bomb. And so, long story short, it turned out it was a fourth grader. And it was just, he had just written it, him and a buddy. They thought it would be funny, kind of a prank thing, and it slipped out of her notebook and fell onto the ground. Somebody picked it up, and it went from there. So, you know, I don't know. This was a young man that the police did show up. The police were there. They were very actively involved in this, and it ultimately identified the young man and had that conversation with him about the consequences. Now, whether that will hit home, because you have to understand, I don't want to throw a whole lot of information out, but this is a kid that's currently in foster care and all sorts. We don't know what's going on in his life, and he may be one that's not understanding consequences just by his life experience. So, yeah, you're right. I mean, certainly need to throw that information out there to them. And I think the kid, when I talked to the kid, he was in a learning position at that point, so to speak.
Thank you for that suggestion. We will definitely work on that. That's an easy one.
You have a question, sir?
It's going to be more of a comment. Just trying to make it quick. I'm not good at that, though. Don't laugh, Lori. Yeah, I'm one of your clients. Earlier this week, I got to speak on a panel down in South Texas. I was with other superintendents from different states. I think there were 6 different states represented on the panel. And we were speaking to Texas superintendents who are dealing with the aftermath of Hurricane Harvey, just from a perspective of people who've been through disasters and had to lead as an administrator through that situation. I was in more during the tornado in 2013, and I guess that's how I got picked up for that. But we all sat around our tables and with the Texas superintendents talking, and we did get sidetracked talking about these kinds of issues. And everybody, whether it's New York, Pennsylvania, Missouri, Oklahoma, Texas, wherever it is, we're all seeing an uptick in this type of incident, whether it's a real threat or a hoax. And we had a hoax as my plane was landing yesterday in Oklahoma City. My phone just starts filling up with messages out of order from several people in this room about a hoax that's happening at one of our middle schools. We get over there, we call parents. You know, hey, we've received this message, and we want you to come pick up your kids if you can. Dallas City Police were all over the place in the building. If it had not been a hoax, the person would have come out and looked around and said, you know, this isn't happening now. You know, I mean, regardless, we did everything that we could to get everything in place. We take it seriously because that's what I would expect as a parent, and I think that's the way we all approached it. The student who created that note has been identified, as well as 2 other students who were in on it, and those students have been arrested and charged with felonies. And one of the TV stations, one of the local stations, interviewed me today, and I think that'll air at 10. And I don't know if this will make it onto the broadcast, but I talk about the fact that there are legal consequences that will affect students for the rest of their lives. Now, when you're 12 or 14 years old, I don't know if that really sinks in, because like you said, you know, their brains aren't fully developed, and well, that's what happened to this kid. That's not what's going to happen to me. So it may not be real, but we're going to try everything that we can as administrators, as school leaders, as teachers, as parents, to talk to our kids about the fact that everything you do has a lasting consequence. And in a situation like this, it's not funny, it's not cute. When I pulled up to that middle school, there were parents running from their cars to try to get to the office as fast as they could and pick up their kids, and there's nothing funny about that. No. And I think that's the message that we have to try to get out to every student that we have, because we are trying to plan for a town hall type meeting and to talk about the things that we have in place and how we are better than we were 5 years ago after Sandy Hook, and how we still need to get better. We're always trying to improve the margin of error. And that's all we can try to do. And we want to have those conversations and not get sidetracked and have every administrator in the district running over to try to manage chaos when there's a hoax. And I think that message is pretty loud and clear at that school right now. But hopefully we can get that out to that message out to more people, because it impacts not only instruction, just it impacts ongoing safety efforts that we have. So sorry, I didn't mean for it to turn into a lecture.
No, that's...
Anyone else have a question or comment?
On top of that, though, I think part of the thing that needs to be emphasized is that people aren't getting away with it.
Right.
You know, if you just tell them about it, and if there've been 10 calls, 9 kids have been caught, somebody might think twice before pulling.
Right. Good point. Good point. Thank you.
Yes, sir. You have a question?
Earlier, you mentioned that school boards 2 years ago were given the ability to create policy if they wanted to arm their teachers. Has there been any that you're aware of, any use of that, and they're actually utilizing that policy? And is it an increasing thing?
Gary nodding his head yes.
Yes, we have school districts that have taken advantage of that. Whether it's increasing or not, I can't tell you that, and I've heard different numbers about how many school districts have chosen to do that. But again, if that's the decision that they make, if the school board chooses to go ahead with that, then we're going to do what we can to support them, making sure that they're doing it as safely as possible.
There was an erroneous report on the east side of the state that said OK Schools was the only state in Oklahoma that had adopted that policy, and that's not true. But OK is probably the most prevalent because they advertised it right from the beginning. They were one of the first. They have large signs posted all over their property that says, members of faculty and staff here are armed and will use whatever force is necessary to defend the students here. So they've gotten a lot of notoriety there, but if you want to research their issues, because I've worked with them on policy, you can Google them, and all their information is on there about how they've implemented that and what they're doing.
And one of the things I do want to add to that with any schools that are discussing that as an option, we remind them that that needs to be the last option. Kind of like the run, hide, fight, avoid, deny, defend, is that we need to make sure that we're still doing drills that are going to be effective, that we're still talking to our kids about options, that what we don't want to do is kind of create a Wild West effect. You know, we want kids' lives to be saved, we want people to be safe, but we know that through practicing that's going to save more lives than anything else.
So of those schools that have taken that on, are they requiring annual ongoing training for the teachers that are allowed to carry? And is that a regular?
I don't have an answer for you on that.
Well, the ones that I'm familiar with, OK does. They have a requirement. There is no statutory requirement for that under that statute that authorizes them to be armed. There is a statutory requirement. If you choose to be armed as a school employee and you've taken the reserve officer route, which is one of the things you have to accomplish, then you have to qualify as a reserve officer. As a security officer, there is a qualification for that. But does the school have to require it? That's not part of policy, but that's one of the policies. When I said we help develop policy with you, we say, listen, this is something you need to consider. Not only do you need to have your employees annually qualify, but the question is going to become, are you going to give them school time to do that? Are you buying the ammunition to practice with? Where are they going to practice? If they get hurt while they're practicing, is that a workers' comp issue? See, this thing gets to be a lot bigger than simply arming someone. We just want you to go in this with your eyes open.
Is that helpful? Okay.
I have had conversation with a couple of schools on that, and the ones that I've talked with have been really proactive in how they want to do it. They're just not diving off into it and say, okay, well, state law says I can do this. My school board has approved me. They have actually reached out and said, what's the best way of going about this? How do we do this? Will you help us do this? And so that's where, like Gary said, we're kind of having that effect of what your policy and procedure are going to say. Well, these are things you need to consider. And most of them are pausing at this particular time, going, well, okay, we understand that. The schools can't say no. They're doing a great job at everything they do with what they have. So the schools that are considering it are really in deep thought about how they're going to accomplish it. So I think that's the best part is they're just not running out there and saying, okay, here's everybody, we're armed, here we go. So they're looking at it and they're really working hard towards either yes or no, how are we going to do this?
Right. Because one of the other conversations that we think is really important is that the people who are creating these acts of violence in schools, they're not logical thinkers. If they were logical thinkers, they wouldn't be doing what they're doing. So we're not talking about, the bank robber from 25 years ago who would think, okay, I want to make sure I get as much money as possible, so I'm going to go to the bank that doesn't have a security guard there because I'm going to have a better chance of getting out what I need. These kids aren't necessarily worried about whether there's guns in schools or not. They're not thinking logically. And so that's one of the things that we're trying to do is make sure that they understand that having guns in schools is not necessarily going to stop anything from happening. It can certainly mitigate the issues without a doubt, but we want them to go into the situation with their eyes wide open and understanding that in some of these cases, in many of these cases, they're talking about taking the life of one of their own students. Kids that they have taught, their neighbors, their kids have played ball with, and so like I said, just making sure that they're considering all of the issues that go along with this.
Final thoughts or comments? Yes, sir.
This relates to Dr. Cobb and others who had questions or made very valid points about seriousness of threats. In April of 2010, a call came into the switchboard at UCO by a male person that said a bomb had been placed in the chemistry building at the college. And of course, it's caused a great amount of concern and alarm on campus. And because of a great amount of some excellent police work through the night, and the next day, we were able to trace cameras from a 7-Eleven store where his call originated, and we're able to identify this 27-year-old student, arrest him, and we took the case to federal court as a federal crime because of the threat of an explosive. We prosecuted that gentleman who received 7 years in federal prison, in addition to several $100,000 worth of damages because of the police work and the time that we calculated that were involved in the investigation of this crime. This guy has served his 7 years. He just served his 7 years and he's now been released, but it is a very, very serious crime that law enforcement takes quite seriously.
All right, well, if you would all help me in showing our appreciation for our panelists coming out here this evening. As I said in the beginning, this is the first of 7. The next one will be the 15th of March, same location on a Thursday night, same time, 6:30 to 8, and we'll be talking about Oklahoma wildfires. So please join us then. Thank you all for coming. Drive safely going home.
Subject matter expert.